Clay tablets lie silent for millennia, yet some of them read less like myth and more like incident reports. They describe weapons that move without hands, decisions made without voices, landscapes altered beyond recovery. The scribes who pressed these signs into wet earth did not write in wonder or fear. They wrote with precision as if accuracy mattered more than belief. Cities are listed, then erased. Soil is described as dead, not cursed. Light appears where fire should not, and sickness follows contact rather than battle. Gods argue not over morality but over control. What emerges from these texts is not a story of faith but of legacy, of forces inherited, restrained, and feared even by those who wielded them. If these records are taken literally, not symbolically, they point toward a past shaped by weapons no human hand could command, and a world still bearing their imprint. Before we dive deeper, ignite that like button and prepare for the revelations to come. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from, what time it is there, and as always with our videos, the visuals are here to add context, but they aren't necessary to follow along. Thank you for always having our back. Prepare yourself, and let's dive in. In the controlled darkness of museum archives, clay tablets rest on shelves like inert objects, yet the language carved into them refuses to stay silent. These are not poems, not heroic epics, not prayers meant to be sung aloud. They are written in a tone closer to accounting than myth, recording actions, consequences, and conditions as if the scribes expected their words to be checked against reality. Many of these tablets come from ancient Nippur, lifted from the ground, scorched, cracked, sometimes partially vitrified, as though they survived an event far more violent than simple abandonment. Their surface bears cuneiform signs pressed with methodical care, even when the edges are broken and entire lines are missing. What remains is enough to disturb the comfortable boundary between legend and report. One tablet in particular, catalogued with a museum number rather than a poetic title, preserves fragments that refuse easy interpretation. Between references to cities that existed before a great catastrophe and deliberations among divine authorities, the text introduces weapons not as symbols of power, but as entities with behavior. The Sumerian word, commonly translated as weapon, appears alongside verbs never applied to ordinary tools. These weapons travel on their own. They speak, they return after completing tasks. They act without requiring a hand to guide them. This is not the elevated language of metaphor. It is procedural, almost mechanical, describing sequences rather than meanings. For decades, scholars explained this away as religious imagination, arguing that ancient people personified natural forces because they lacked scientific language. Lightning became a god's spear, storms became divine anger. Yet these tablets resist that interpretation. The descriptions are repeated across centuries, copied in different cities, maintaining the same attributes with unsettling consistency. Myths usually evolve. Details blur, symbols shift. Here, the characteristics remain fixed, as if accuracy mattered. The scribes were not embellishing, they were preserving specifications. In temple inventories, these weapons are listed as physical objects. They are stored, wrapped in textiles, sealed behind doors. Access is restricted. Only priests who have undergone purification are permitted near them, and even then under strict conditions. Some tablets include explicit warnings. Improper handling results in death. This is an odd claim if the object in question is purely symbolic. Symbols do not require quarantine. Allegories do not kill caretakers. One Assyrian record recounts an incident without drama or explanation. Priests opened a sealed chamber without completing the prescribed procedures. Within days, 7 of them were dead. Others fell ill, lingering for weeks. The text does not describe divine punishment or moral failure. It simply records the outcome and the administrative response. The chamber was resealed, access was forbidden for a year, the weapon was returned to rest. The language resembles that of a safety report, not a sermon. To understand why this matters, it is necessary to set aside modern distinctions between myth and history. The Sumerians did not separate the two the way later cultures did. They recorded what they considered significant, using the most precise language available to them. Their writing system developed for trade, logistics, and law before it was ever used for theology. When they describe something as moving, speaking, or causing death, they do so with the same verbs used elsewhere for humans, animals, or processes. The discomfort arises not from their worldview, but from ours. The beings associated with these weapons, later labeled as gods, behave less like abstractions and more like administrators. They convene councils, assign territories, negotiate responsibilities, and argue over jurisdiction. When negotiations fail, conflict follows. The resulting war is not portrayed as cosmic symbolism. It leaves physical scars, mountains are split, plains become barren, cities vanish so completely that nothing grows there for generations. The texts emphasize not the clash itself, but what remains afterward. Modern archaeology complicates matters further. In several locations across Mesopotamia, researchers have identified layers of vitrified soil where sand has fused into glass. Achieving this requires temperatures far beyond what Bronze Age fires or conventional warfare could produce, especially over wide areas. The ancient scribes had no concept of temperature as a measurable quantity, but they recognized effect. They described earth that shone unnaturally, ground that hardened like fired pottery, land that could no longer sustain life. Across these accounts, a single idea repeats with chilling clarity. The weapons attributed to the Anunnaki are not human-made. They predate the Sumerians themselves. They are inherited, feared even by those who command them. They can be awakened and put back to sleep, but never destroyed. This explains why temples functioned not only as centers of worship, but as containment sites. Beneath them, chambers were constructed with unusual features: metal linings, multiple sealed doors, ventilation shafts designed to isolate rather than illuminate. These were not shrines, they were vaults. Rituals associated with these weapons read less like acts of devotion and more like procedures. Words commonly translated as purification include washing, changing garments, removing metal objects, limiting exposure time. The goal appears not spiritual cleanliness but reduction of risk. The repeated insistence that weapons must remain asleep suggests an understanding that inactivity does not equal harmlessness. Even dormant, they retain dangerous properties. The emotional tone of these texts is also telling. There is no triumph in victory, no glorification of destruction. Instead, there is restraint, caution, and often fear. The weapons are described as ancient and uncontrollable, capable of turning even their masters into victims if mishandled. This is a strange attitude for mythological deities, but a familiar one for those dealing with forces they barely understand. What emerges is not a tale of gods wielding magic, but of caretakers managing remnants of something older and more powerful than themselves. The Sumerians inherited a damaged world and dangerous tools, and they responded by documenting, restricting, and remembering. Their tablets do not ask for belief, they ask to be read carefully. They stand as records from a civilization that may have known, through hard experience, that some technologies cannot be safely used, only contained. As the tablets continue to speak across time, they force a difficult question. If these descriptions are not allegory but observation filtered through the limits of ancient language, then the past they describe was shaped by weapons whose effects we would recognize today, even if their creators would not. And if that is true, then the line between myth and memory is far thinner than we have been willing to admit. Among the weapons described in the Sumerian corpus, one stands apart not because of its destructive power, but because of how it behaves. It is not carried, not thrown, not swung, it is sent. The scribes describe it moving independently across long distances, entering cities, passing through sanctuaries, delivering information, receiving replies, and returning to its origin. The tone remains flat, almost indifferent, as though this sequence required no explanation. To the ancient writer, the strange thing was not that the weapon acted on its own, but that it had something important to report. The text in which this object appears most clearly is known today by its opening word, a convention used because ancient works rarely carried titles. It recounts the campaign of a warrior authority responsible for enforcing order after negotiations collapse. Yet the central figure of the narrative is not the commander himself, but the instrument that goes ahead of him. The weapon is called Sharur. Translators struggle with the name, rendering it as Royal Hunter or Great Punisher, but those labels miss the point. Sharur is not an extension of a warrior's arm. It functions as an agent. Sharur travels alone. No escort accompanies it. It crosses territory, enters restricted spaces, and speaks directly to high-ranking authorities. Its speech is recorded in direct dialogue, not as poetic flourish, but as quoted instruction and analysis. It reports the disposition of hostile forces, assesses risk, and recommends action. In one passage, it warns that the situation ahead is unstable and urges immediate intervention. The authority who sent it listens and alters his plans accordingly. This detail is crucial. The weapon does not merely obey, it evaluates, it initiates communication, it proposes solutions. In at least one instance, it advises abandoning an intended attack route due to unseen danger. The commander accepts the advice. The text offers no justification, no explanation, no hint that this is metaphor. The scribal language does not shift into the elevated register used elsewhere for symbolic animation. It remains administrative, using the same verbs found in letters, delivery records, and legal notices. Ancient Sumerian literature does know how to personify objects. When that happens, the language changes dramatically, epithets multiply, the tone becomes ceremonial. None of that appears here. Sharur is described doing things, not embodying ideas. The verbs used for its movement and speech are identical to those used when a messenger travels between cities or when an official reports to a superior. The scribes treat Sharur as an operative component within a larger system. Even more unsettling is the insistence that Sharur's movement cannot be understood, even by other divine authorities. The text explicitly states that its path is not comprehended by gods outside its command structure. Once released, it cannot be intercepted or forcibly recalled. Only the one who possesses authority over it can command its return. This is not the language of mythic omnipotence. It is the language of control protocols. Later hymns expand on this description without altering its core features. Sharur is said to go ahead of armies, to see the way before others do, to identify danger before it manifests. Yet the emphasis remains on function, not wonder. One line notes that even those who benefit from Sharur's service do not fully grasp how it navigates. The implication is not mystery for its own sake, but operational opacity. Temple records from later periods add another layer. Sharur is listed among stored objects. It is kept dormant. The same vocabulary used for putting living beings to sleep is applied here, but without metaphorical framing. To sleep in this context means inactive but not neutralized. Special rites are performed to ensure that this state is maintained. The weapon is not broken down, dismantled or displayed. It is secured. Repeated warnings accompany these records. Awakening the weapon without authorization leads to disastrous consequences. The texts do not describe these consequences in moral terms. They do not speak of divine anger or cosmic imbalance. They simply list outcomes: sickness, death, contamination of space. The consistent avoidance of explanation suggests that the cause was considered self-evident to those trained in the procedures. Viewed without the assumption of allegory, Sharur begins to resemble something profoundly modern, an autonomous system capable of reconnaissance, communication, and limited decision-making, a device that operates within assigned parameters but can adapt based on input, a tool that answers to a single authority and resists interference. The Sumerians lacked words for systems, algorithms, or programming, but they had verbs for knowing, seeing, going, and speaking. They used those verbs carefully. Sharur is not unique. Other weapons in the texts share similar traits. Some are said to precede armies, others to locate targets, others to return with reports. The common thread is independence from human handling. Ordinary weapons, the scribes note, require strength, direction, and proximity. These do not. They know the way themselves. The distinction is explicit. Human tools are guided. Divine weapons are autonomous. This contrast matters because it shows that the scribes understood the difference. They did not conflate metaphor with mechanism. They categorized. They observed. They preserved distinctions that would have been unnecessary if all of this were purely symbolic. If the goal was storytelling, complexity could be reduced. Instead, complexity is maintained and transmitted. What follows Sharur's reconnaissance is equally telling. When such weapons shift from observation to attack, the descriptions change focus. The scribes stop paying attention to battlefield movements and begin cataloguing environmental effects: landforms altered, soil rendered lifeless, cities that cannot be reoccupied. The implication is clear: reconnaissance is controlled, deployment is catastrophic. Sharur's role, then, is not destruction, but preparation. It makes war possible without immediate engagement. It informs decisions. It reduces uncertainty. In doing so, it becomes indispensable and therefore dangerous. A weapon that thinks even within limits is not easily replaced or restrained. The texts suggest awareness of this risk. Control over Sharur is portrayed as rare, tightly regulated, and central to authority. The absence of spectacle is perhaps the most disturbing element. There is no awe in the descriptions, no attempt to impress the reader. Sharur's actions are narrated the way a scribe would note the arrival of grain or the inspection of a canal. This calmness implies familiarity. It implies repetition. Whatever Sharur was, it was not an anomaly. It was part of an established operational reality. If these accounts preserve memory rather than myth, then Sharur represents something far beyond a poetic weapon. It represents a technological capacity the Sumerians did not invent but inherited and learned to manage imperfectly. They did not celebrate it. They documented it, restricted it, and warned against misuse. And in doing so, they left behind one of the earliest records of a tool that acts without hands, decides without emotion, and obeys only those with the authority to command it. When the Sumerian tablets move from weapons that observe to weapons that strike, the tone does not become dramatic. It becomes clinical. The scribes are no longer concerned with who advances or who retreats. Their attention narrows to what happens to the land itself. This shift is deliberate. Battles pass quickly. Consequences endure. The texts reflect that priority with unsettling consistency. One of the first destructive instruments described after Sharur is called Mitu. Modern translations often flatten the word into something familiar, rendering it as club or mace. That choice creates a false sense of understanding because nothing in the descriptions aligns with a handheld weapon. Mitu does not strike walls, soldiers, or gates. It strikes mountains. Entire ranges are said to be split, as if cut reeds, a comparison that would have been meaningless if the audience had not already seen terrain transformed beyond recognition. The verbs used to describe Mitu's action imply a single, decisive event. There is no prolonged assault. There is an impact, followed by change. The ground heaves, then hardens. The earth is said to shimmer, not with flame, but with a static brightness that remains after the event. The word chosen for this brightness is not the one used for fire or sunlight. It refers to an intense, unmoving radiance, the kind associated elsewhere with polished stone or glazed surfaces. This distinction matters. Fire moves, it consumes fuel and dies out. The light associated with Mitu does neither. It appears suddenly and lingers. The text note that even the divine authorities turn away from it. This is not reverence, it is avoidance. In one passage, the brightness is described as unbearable to look upon, not because it is holy, but because it harms. The surface left behind after Mitu's strike is described using terminology borrowed from pottery workshops. The same word that refers to ceramic after firing is applied to the ground. The earth becomes smooth, hardened, reflective. In everyday records, this word is never metaphorical. It denotes a material state achieved through extreme heat. The scribes had no thermometers, but they knew the transformation intimately from kilns and furnaces. They recognized it when they saw it on a scale no kiln could produce. These descriptions align disturbingly well with archaeological findings scattered across Mesopotamia. In multiple locations, layers of soil have been discovered fused into glass. Such vitrification requires temperatures far beyond those generated by burning structures or weapons of the Bronze Age. The areas affected are often localized, inconsistent with wildfires or floods, but consistent with directed energy or focused impact. The tablets do not theorize about cause, they document effect. Another weapon follows, named shukur. Translators label it as a spear or dart, but again, the behavior contradicts the label. Shukur strikes before sound arrives. The scribes emphasize this sequence repeatedly. First there is light, then the impact is felt. Only afterward does noise follow, if at all. This reversal is noted as strange because in the Sumerian world, sound usually preceded understanding. Thunder accompanied lightning. Here, perception lags behind destruction. Shukur operates at distance. It crosses valleys, reaches across plains, and finds targets beyond the horizon. No known projectile of the era could do this with precision. Yet the texts express no doubt. They record the event as fact. Victims collapse without visible wounds. There is no blood, no broken flesh. People fall intact as if their bodies simply stop functioning. The scribes register confusion but not disbelief. They do not attempt explanation. They list the result and move on. The absence of physical trauma troubles modern readers more than it troubled ancient ones. For the scribes, the important detail is that walls offer no protection. Shukr does not behave like a thrown object. It arrives without warning and leaves little trace except for dead bodies and altered ground. The implication is not subtle. This is not kinetic force. It is something else, something that acts through space rather than across it. Even more unsettling is the weapon called jitukul. Its defining characteristic is not destruction, but penetration. It passes through barriers without breaking them. Walls remain standing, gates remain closed. Inside, however, life ends. The scribes struggle to describe this effect, resorting to phrases that emphasize ignorance rather than understanding. The weapon does not know stone or wood. Material offers no resistance. This is not siege warfare. It is not assault. It is intrusion. The texts underline the confusion of observers who cannot reconcile intact structures with dead occupants. Once again, there is no poetic framing. The scribes do not dress this in mythic language. They describe what was seen, even when it made no sense within their existing models of violence. Alongside these instruments appears another force, distinct from impact or penetration. It is called melem. Modern translations often render it as radiance or aura, but those words soften its effect. Melem is not passive. It precedes armies and alters behavior. Those exposed to it lose the will to resist. They are immobilized by fear so intense it overrides conscious thought. The texts distinguish this fear from ordinary terror. This is not the panic of seeing an enemy approach. It is described as a paralysis of the mind. People fall without fighting. Armies dissolve before contact. Melem can be activated and deactivated. It can be worn, deployed, withdrawn. This implies control, not emotion. Some passages state explicitly that melem affects thought rather than flesh. The scribes understood the difference. They had words for pain, injury, and death. They chose different terms here. This was a state imposed from outside, not a reaction generated within. The ability to induce such a state is treated as a weapon in its own right. What unites all these instruments is not their form, but their consequences. They act quickly. They leave long-term damage. They remain dangerous even when inactive. This explains the obsessive focus on storage and restraint. The scribes repeatedly stress that these weapons must sleep. They must be sealed. They must be kept below ground. This language is not metaphorical comfort. It is operational necessity. In several texts, improper deactivation leads to lingering effects. People fall ill days later. Land remains sterile. The idea of residual influence appears again and again. Something remains after use, invisible but harmful. The transition from Sharur to Mitu, Shukr, jitukul, and melem traces a clear escalation. First comes observation, then targeted strikes, then environmental devastation. Finally, psychological collapse. This is not mythic chaos, it is a system. By the time the scribes reach the end of these descriptions, the focus shifts away from victory entirely. What matters is containment. The repeated insistence that such weapons not be used lightly suggests that their effects exceeded intention. The Anunnaki themselves are said to fear the aftermath. If these accounts preserve memory rather than metaphor, then the Sumerians were cataloguing not divine fantasy, but the ruins of a technological conflict. They did not understand the mechanisms, but they recognized the patterns. And they recorded them with a clarity that still unsettles, because the world they describe is not one of heroic gods, but of forces that permanently reshape the ground beneath human feet. Beyond the individual weapons described in earlier tablets, the Sumerian texts introduce something far more unsettling, a coordinated system. These are not single instruments wielded by one authority, but a group that functions together, each part distinct yet inseparable from the whole. The scribes do not give them a collective name beyond a number. They are simply called the Seven. The lack of ornamentation in this label is striking. There is no mythic title, no poetic flourish, just a count, as if enumeration itself were sufficient. The Seven appear most clearly in texts associated with a destructive authority whose domain includes war, plague, and societal collapse. Unlike earlier narratives that move fluidly between imagery and action, these accounts are rigidly structured. Cause precedes decision, decision precedes preparation, preparation precedes deployment. The scribes take care to preserve this order, suggesting that sequence matters. This is not spontaneous wrath. It is a deliberate release. What immediately stands out is the language used to describe the origin of the Seven. They are not born. They are not summoned from elsewhere. They are made. The verb employed in the original language is the same one used for crafting tools, assembling components, or constructing structures. This choice is deliberate. Living beings are born or created. Objects are made. The Seven belong to the latter category. Each of the Seven has a defined function. The texts do not linger on appearance, but they are precise about effect. One advances at the front, breaking resistance. Another moves along the sides, preventing escape. A third operates from above, while a fourth works below, disturbing the ground itself. The remaining elements are associated with darkness, suffocation, and desiccation. These are not random traits. Together they form a comprehensive envelope of destruction. The most disturbing aspect is not what each one does, but how they do it together. The scribes emphasize coordination. The Seven move as one. They are aware of each other's position. They strike simultaneously. Communication between them does not require speech. This point is repeated almost redundantly, as if the writer wanted to ensure it was not misunderstood. For an ancient observer, such behavior was inexplicable. Only living beings coordinated actions in this way, and even then imperfectly. Yet the texts insist the Seven are not alive. They do not eat. They do not sleep. They do not age. They are activated and deactivated. These are not the verbs of biology. They are the verbs of mechanisms. When they are released, the narrative shifts entirely away from human experience and focuses on systemic collapse. Cities cease to function in stages. First structures fail. Then darkness spreads. Air becomes hostile. Water turns unusable. Finally, the land itself is described as dead. The scribes use a term reserved elsewhere for incurable illness. This is not temporary devastation, it is lasting damage. People do not return, crops do not regrow, generations pass before any sign of recovery appears, if it appears at all. One passage records a moment of hesitation among the authorities responsible for releasing the Seven. This hesitation is not moral, it is practical. The concern expressed is that the outcome may exceed calculation. After deployment, this fear proves justified. The destruction spreads beyond its initial target. The texts describe alarm among those who ordered the action. They did not anticipate the full extent of the aftermath. This detail is crucial. In mythological narratives, gods control outcomes. Here, control is partial at best. Once the seven are released, they follow their function, not intention. The scribes do not attribute this to divine mystery. They simply record that consequences went beyond expectation. The implication is clear. This was a system whose power outstripped the ability of its users to fully predict results. Following this event, a decision is recorded. The seven are not destroyed. That option is never mentioned. Instead, they are sent away to the edges of the world. The language suggests removal rather than banishment. They are placed where they cannot easily be accessed. There, they are put to sleep. The word used again implies inactivity, not elimination. Later texts reinforce this decision through ritual language, but the intent remains defensive. Incantations do not ask the seven for mercy. They ask that the seven not find the way. This phrasing is revealing. It assumes agency of movement and the danger of proximity. Protection is achieved not through appeasement, but through concealment. Astronomical records introduce an additional layer. In some texts, the seven are associated with a group of 7 stars that move together across the sky. The association is careful, not explicit. The stars are not called the seven, but the parallel is noted. They move as a group, they maintain formation. Whether this is symbolic or observational is left unresolved. The scribes do not explain. They simply align patterns. Archaeology again echoes the written record. Destruction layers in Mesopotamian cities often show extreme localization. One district is obliterated, another nearby remains largely intact. This pattern defies explanation by fire, flood, or invasion. It aligns far more closely with targeted deployment. The tablets describe exactly such outcomes. What makes the seven especially troubling is the absence of glorification. There are no hymns praising their power, no celebrations of victory. Instead, there is fear, restraint, and avoidance. The scribes treat the seven as a last resort, a measure taken only when all others fail. Even then, the aftermath is described as something to regret. This attitude persists in later periods. Long after the original language fell out of daily use, texts referencing the seven continued to be copied, not elaborated, not dramatized, preserved. Their function in the archive appears to be cautionary. They are examples of something that once happened and must not be repeated. If the seven were purely symbolic, this persistence would be unnecessary. Symbols evolve, they adapt, they merge with new narratives. The seven do not. Their description remains fixed, their consequences unchanged. This rigidity suggests that what was being preserved was not a story, but a warning. Taken together, the seven represent the apex of the system described across the tablets. Autonomous elements, coordinated action, overwhelming force, irreversible damage, and loss of control. The scribes did not frame this as divine drama, they framed it as precedent, and precedents exist to be remembered, not reenacted. Across the Sumerian and Akkadian texts, whenever weapons act without hands and systems move without visible command, a single object eventually enters the narrative. It is not described with the language of violence or force. It does not strike, burn, or terrify. Yet without it, nothing else functions. This object is called the Tablet of Destinies, and despite later interpretations that soften it into a symbol of authority or cosmic law, the earliest texts are unambiguous. The tablet is a physical thing. It can be held, it can be taken, it can be lost. it can be stolen. And when it is removed from its place, the world does not merely fall into disorder, it stops responding. One account describes the moment the tablet leaves its chamber. Immediately, divine functions fail. Weapons do not obey commands. Radiance disappears. Movement halts. Even the authorities themselves become immobilized, unable to act. This is not framed as political chaos or moral imbalance. It is presented as a systemic failure. Something essential has been disconnected. The language used is precise. The tablet does not grant legitimacy in an abstract sense. It enables operation. When it is absent, systems that normally act autonomously become inert or erratic. This distinction matters because mythic symbols rarely behave this way. Power in myth is persuasive. Here, power is technical. The story in which this is clearest involves a trusted attendant who gains access to the tablet and seizes it. The act is sudden. There is no ritual challenge, no dramatic confrontation. The consequence is immediate and catastrophic. Control over autonomous weapons shifts instantly. Those who previously commanded them can no longer issue effective orders. Attacks fail not because of resistance, but because the systems themselves no longer accept instruction. When attempts are made to confront the thief using conventional weapons, something unexpected happens. The weapons turn back. The strikes dissolve before impact. The texts describe arrows losing cohesion, blows failing to connect. The cause is not defensive magic, it is command override. The one holding the tablet issues instructions, and the systems comply. Only when communication is disrupted does resistance become possible. In one passage, the thief is finally confronted amid storm and noise, conditions that prevent the tablet from being used effectively. This detail is easily overlooked, but it is critical. It implies that the tablet requires interaction to function. It must be accessed, engaged, actively used. It is not an aura, it is an interface. Once the tablet is recovered, normal function resumes. Weapons respond again. Radiance returns, movement is restored. The transition is abrupt, not gradual. This reads less like the restoration of divine order and more like the rebooting of a system after control is re-established. Later texts add physical details. The tablet is heavy. It requires both hands to hold. It emits a glow. It must be touched to activate its function. It does not operate at a distance. These specifics are unnecessary if the tablet is merely symbolic. They are essential if it is a device. Another concept frequently associated with the tablet is MI, a term often translated as divine decree or cosmic rule. In the context of weaponry, MI behaves differently. Weapons are said to be given MI before deployment. Without it, they do not know their path. They remain dormant or confused. With it, they awaken and execute their assigned function. The parallels to configuration or activation parameters are difficult to ignore. Me can also be removed. Texts describe weapons losing their MI and becoming ineffective. This is not portrayed as a loss of blessing or favor. It is a functional shutdown. The weapon still exists, but it no longer acts. The scribes treat this as a technical state, not a moral one. Temple inventories reinforce this interpretation. The Tablet of Destinies appears in lists of stored objects, complete with location and access restrictions. It is kept separate from other weapons, secured behind multiple barriers. Only the highest authority are permitted near it. Any unauthorized contact is described as fatal. The warning is blunt and consistent. Those who touch it without permission do not survive. Again, the texts do not attribute this to curse or divine wrath. They do not say the gods strike the offender. they say the offender dies. The distinction is subtle but important. Cause is left unstated, but consequence is certain. This suggests danger inherent to the object itself, not punishment imposed externally. When all references are assembled, a coherent picture emerges. The Tablet of Destinies functions as a central control module. It does not fight. It governs those that do. Autonomous weapons, coordinated systems like the Seven, radiance fields, and remote strike instruments all respond to its authority. Without it, they either fail or become uncontrollable. This explains why conflict over the tablet is so intense. It is not a struggle for prestige, it is a struggle for access. Whoever holds the tablet controls the entire arsenal. Whoever loses it becomes powerless regardless of rank or strength. It also explains why the tablet is never destroyed. The texts do not even consider that option. Instead, the focus is always on retrieval, protection, and containment. If destruction were possible, it would be the obvious solution. Its absence suggests either inability or unacceptable risk. The temple's role becomes clearer in this light. It is not merely a house of worship. It is a control center. Above ground, rituals reinforce hierarchy and legitimacy. Below ground, devices are secured, isolated, and monitored. The separation is intentional. Visibility belongs to religion. Power is hidden. As time passes, later cultures reinterpret the tablet. Its technical function fades from understanding. It becomes law, fate, destiny in the abstract sense. But traces of its original role remain embedded in the text, resistant to reinterpretation. Heavy, glowing, touched, lost, recovered. These are not the attributes of an idea. If the earlier weapons resemble autonomous systems and the seven resemble coordinated platforms, then the tablet represents the core of the architecture. It is the point at which intention becomes action. Without it, even gods are reduced to spectators. And that is perhaps the most unsettling implication preserved in these ancient records. Power did not reside in beings alone. It resided in access to a device that could command forces beyond direct control. The Tablet of Destinies was not a metaphor for authority. It was authority, rendered tangible, dangerous, and absolute. Among all the forces recorded in the Sumerian and Akkadian texts, none is treated with more hesitation than the flood. It is not listed alongside weapons like Sharur or Mitu, yet it is discussed in the same operational language. The flood is never described as an accident of nature. It is a measure, a mechanism, a release that must be authorized, delayed, debated, and ultimately sealed again. This distinction separates it sharply from later moralized retellings. In the earliest versions, the problem prompting the flood is framed with unusual bluntness. Humanity has become too numerous. Cities expand, the noise increases. This noise is not symbolic of sin or rebellion. It is literal disturbance, described as preventing rest and disrupting order. The complaint is practical, not ethical. The response unfolds in stages, each one deliberate. First come limited interventions. Disease spreads, crops fail, water recedes. Each measure reduces the population temporarily. Each time recovery follows. The texts track this pattern without commentary, as if reviewing unsuccessful attempts at mitigation. Only when these measures fail repeatedly does the discussion turn toward the flood. The language shifts at this point. The flood is not summoned, it is unlocked. The words used refer to bolts, seals, barriers, and restraints. Something is being held back. The decision is not to create water, but to release what is already contained. This choice of vocabulary is consistent across multiple tablets and languages, suggesting it is not poetic invention, but technical convention. When authorization is given, the flood begins simultaneously from above and below. Gates in the sky open, sources in the deep are unsealed. The coordination is emphasized. This is not rain alone nor groundwater alone. It is a system acting in concert. The effect is immediate and overwhelming. The description of the event itself is strikingly restrained. Cities vanish, people drown, mountains disappear beneath the water. Yet the scribes avoid dramatization. There are no cries, no pleas, no moral lessons embedded in the narrative. The focus remains on sequence and outcome. Then something unexpected occurs. The authorities responsible for the release react with fear. They retreat, they cluster together, described as crouching and shrinking away from what they have unleashed. One line notes explicitly that they did not anticipate such force. This admission is extraordinary. In myth, gods are never surprised by their own actions. Here, surprise is central. The flood exceeds its intended scope. It does not merely reduce population, it threatens total annihilation. The texts make clear that control is lost once the release begins. What was meant as a corrective measure becomes an existential danger. After the waters recede, the tone shifts again. The concern is no longer the noise of humanity, but the permanence of the damage. The land is altered. Settlements are gone. Survivors are rare. When it is discovered that some life has endured, the reaction is not relief, but anger. Not because survival is immoral, but because the plan was incomplete. This reaction leads to debate. The conclusion reached is not to refine the flood or improve its targeting, it is to forbid its future use. The language here is absolute. The flood is not to be deployed again, ever. The reason given is not compassion, it is risk. The mechanism is too destructive, too difficult to control, too capable of eliminating everything, including those who authorize it. From this point forward, the flood is treated as a sealed system. Rituals are instituted to ensure that the gates remain closed. Each year, ceremonies reaffirm the closure. Later readers interpreted these acts as symbolic reminders of a covenant. The earlier texts suggest something more literal. Maintenance procedures intended to prevent accidental release. Archaeological evidence complicates the picture. Mesopotamia experienced numerous floods, some catastrophic, yet certain flood layers differ from ordinary inundation. They appear suddenly, span wide areas, and leave behind sterile deposits rather than gradual sedimentation. These layers correspond in time to cultural disruptions described in the texts. The tablets do not deny natural flooding. They distinguish between ordinary events and the flood. Ordinary floods are localized and survivable. The flood is singular and transformative. It resets the world. After this event, the textual record changes noticeably. Direct references to the use of extreme weapons diminish. The emphasis shifts toward containment, sleep, and restraint. Words associated with sealing and binding appear with increasing frequency. The authorities are no longer eager to intervene directly. They act through intermediaries. This transition marks the end of an era. The period in which weapons reshape the earth openly gives way to one in which their existence is acknowledged but suppressed. The flood becomes a boundary marker in memory. Before it, intervention was direct. After it, caution dominates. The fear associated with the flood lingers long after the event. Later, incantations do not ask for rain or fertility in the same language. They ask for stability, for gates to remain closed, for depths to stay restrained. The threat is remembered not as punishment but as a force that nearly escaped control. The flood is never glorified. It is never praised. It is referenced with care, often indirectly. This restraint suggests trauma rather than triumph. The scribes preserve the memory because forgetting it would be dangerous. If the earlier weapons resemble targeted systems and the 7 represent coordinated devastation, the flood stands apart as a planetary-scale release. It is not a tool of war, but of erasure. Its one-time use appears to have convinced those responsible that some mechanisms cannot be safely employed at all. In this light, the flood narrative ceases to be a moral fable and becomes a cautionary record. It documents a decision made, a system released, and a lesson learned too late. The lesson is not about obedience or righteousness, it is about limits. After the flood, the texts increasingly emphasize sleep, sealing, and distance. The world continues, but under new constraints. The memory of near-total loss reshapes policy, ritual, and restraint. The flood becomes the final argument against unrestricted power, and from that moment on, the greatest priority is no longer control of the world, but prevention of another irreversible release. After the flood, the tone of the tablets changes in ways that are subtle but unmistakable. The language becomes careful, restrained, almost guarded. Where earlier texts speak openly of deployment and consequence, later ones circle around those topics, emphasizing rest, sleep, and sealing. This is not poetic maturation, it is behavioral change. The scribes are recording a new policy shaped by experience. Weapons that once acted openly are now described as dormant. They are not gone, they are not destroyed, they are asleep. This word appears again and again, applied with consistency. Sleep here does not mean inactivity without risk. It means a controlled state that must be maintained. The danger has not vanished, it has been contained. The texts make clear that maintaining this state requires constant attention. Rituals become more elaborate, but their structure reveals their true purpose. They are not supplications, they are procedures. Steps are followed in strict order. Omissions are treated as errors, not sins. Consequences are described as outcomes, not punishments. In several late records, scribes note incidents where procedures were not followed precisely. The descriptions are brief and unemotional. A chamber was opened too long, a seal was broken out of sequence, purification was incomplete. The result is always the same: illness, death, contamination. The response is immediate isolation and resealing. There is no appeal to mercy, only correction. This procedural mindset extends to architecture. Temples built after the flood period show changes beneath their foundations. Underground chambers become more complex. Walls are reinforced with layers of metal, uncommon in earlier construction. Lead and copper appear where stone would have sufficed. These materials have no symbolic value in ritual architecture, but they have practical properties. They block, they shield, they contain. Ventilation shafts appear in places where light is not needed. Airflow is controlled, not invited. Multiple doors are installed in sequence, creating compartments rather than open spaces. These are not storage rooms for offerings, they are isolation units. Inventories from this period list weapons and objects with increasing specificity. Locations are recorded, access permissions are noted, time limits are imposed on proximity. Some tablets specify how long a person may remain inside a chamber before withdrawal is mandatory. This is not religious devotion, it is exposure management. The role of the priesthood also shifts. Earlier texts present priests as mediators between humans and gods. Later ones emphasize their technical responsibility. They are custodians trained in procedures passed down with little explanation. In some tablets, scribes admit that the meaning of certain words is no longer fully understood, but the steps must still be followed exactly. This admission is critical. It signals a break between knowledge and practice. The original understanding of why procedures exist has faded, but the memory of consequences remains. Fear replaces comprehension. Precision replaces belief. At the same time, the authorities described in the texts become more distant. Direct intervention by higher powers decreases. Instead, human rulers appear more frequently as intermediaries. Kings are said to be given weapons or radiance, but the descriptions are careful. They do not claim ownership. They claim authorization. This distinction matters. The king does not wield the weapon freely. He is granted limited access under supervision. Inscriptions boast that a ruler marched with the radiance of a higher authority before him. Traditionally, this is read as metaphor. In context, it reads as controlled deployment. Something is activated briefly, then withdrawn. Notably, later, historical records contain fewer descriptions of catastrophic aftermath. Wars are fought, cities fall, but the land recovers. The absence of environmental ruin suggests that the most extreme weapons are no longer used. They remain sealed, their existence acknowledged, but their application forbidden. This restraint is framed not as moral progress, but as necessity. The texts never claim the weapons were wrong. They claim they were dangerous. The lesson learned from the flood and earlier devastations is not humility, but caution. One recurring phrase captures this shift: let the weapon remain asleep. This is not a prayer, it is a directive. Sleep must be maintained. Disturbance must be avoided. Knowledge of location must be restricted. The emphasis on secrecy increases. Texts dealing with weapons are stored separately from hymns and myths. They are copied less frequently. When they are copied verbatim, without embellishment. Some tablets include notes stating they are not to be read aloud. This is extraordinary in a culture where public recitation was common. The scribes themselves seem aware of the burden they are preserving. In rare marginal notes, they describe the texts as heavy or dangerous. These words are not metaphors for emotional weight, they are warnings. Over time, the original context erodes. Languages change. Sumerian becomes a scholarly tongue rather than a living one. New generations copy words they no longer fully grasp. Technical descriptions harden into ritual formulae. Devices become symbols. This process is gradual and uneven. Some texts retain clarity longer than others, but the trend is clear. As understanding fades, reverence grows. What was once managed becomes worshipped. What was once feared for practical reasons becomes feared for moral ones. The danger, however, does not disappear with reinterpretation. The procedures remain because the consequences remain. Even when the reason for a rule is forgotten, the rule survives because breaking it still leads to harm. This creates a paradoxical culture of restraint without explanation. Priests and rulers follow steps whose origin lies beyond memory. They know only that deviation brings disaster. This is not superstition, it is inherited risk management. By the end of this period, the tablets no longer describe the use of the most destructive systems. They describe their maintenance, they describe vigilance, they describe distance. The world continues under these constraints. Civilization advances not by mastering the inherited weapons, but by avoiding them. Law replaces force, irrigation replaces devastation. Order is maintained through structure rather than intervention. Yet beneath the temples the sealed chambers remain. The weapons sleep, but they are not gone. The texts ensure that memory, however distorted, survives. They are not instructions for use, they are records of why use must be avoided. In preserving them, the scribes were not glorifying the past, they were warning the future. They understood that knowledge could fade, but consequences would not. And so the tablets endure, carrying forward a lesson learned at great cost. Some powers, once unleashed, change the world too deeply to ever be justified again. As centuries pass within the tablets, a quiet shift becomes impossible to ignore. The weapons do not vanish from memory, but they retreat deeper into controlled spaces, both physical and linguistic. The scribes stop describing how they act and begin recording how they are kept. This change is not accidental. It reflects a civilization learning to live beside something it no longer dares to touch. The most revealing evidence of this transition lies beneath the temples themselves. Excavations show that early sacred structures were simple in their foundations. Later ones are not. Beneath major temples in cities like Nippur, Uruk, and Ur, archaeologists uncovered chambers that do not resemble tombs, treasuries, or shrines. They are sealed, layered, and deliberately isolated. Their design suggests caution rather than ceremony. Some of these underground rooms are lined with sheets of copper or lead, metals that held little religious meaning but possess practical qualities. They block, absorb, and shield. For a culture that used stone and mud brick almost exclusively, this choice is striking. Metal was expensive. It was not used where it could not be seen unless its function mattered more than its appearance. The chambers often contain multiple doors arranged in sequence. Opening one does not reveal the interior, only another barrier. This creates compartments, not passageways. In several cases, traces of bitumen and resin appear along door frames, indicating an effort to seal gaps airtight. Ventilation shafts exist, but they do not admit light. They bend, narrow, and divert, designed to move air while preventing direct exposure. These features make little sense as ritual spaces. They make perfect sense as containment environments. Temple inventories support this interpretation. Objects associated with divine weapons are always listed as being stored below. Their locations are specified with unusual precision. Instructions note how many doors separate them from the surface. Time limits are imposed on those who enter. No such restrictions apply to statues, offerings, or sacred texts. One Assyrian administrative tablet outlines a routine inspection of a sealed object. The language is procedural, almost bureaucratic. The object is removed, observed, and returned. The process is timed. No description of appearance is given. The only concern is that the seals are restored correctly. When the procedure is completed, the text records that the object has been returned to sleep. In a separate record, something goes wrong. The text is brief and stark. After an inspection, several priests fall ill. Their symptoms are not described in detail, but the outcome is some die quickly, others weaken over days. The response is immediate. The chamber is sealed. Access is forbidden for a full year. There is no mention of prayer or appeasement, only isolation. Medical tablets from the same period describe illnesses with similar progression: hair loss, skin lesions, fatigue leading to death. These symptoms are not attributed to spirits or curses. They are treated as exposure. Patients are separated from others. Their belongings are burned. Contact is restricted. The overlap in language between medical and temple records is difficult to dismiss. The scribes never say what causes these effects. They do not speculate. They simply note that proximity leads to decline. The implication is that the cause is invisible and persistent, lingering even after the object is sealed again. This aligns with the repeated emphasis on time limits and ventilation. As understanding fades, caution increases. Later texts show growing anxiety about unauthorized access. Warnings become sharper. Some tablets state plainly that touching certain objects without clearance results in death before sunrise. This is not framed as divine judgment. It is presented as certainty. At the same time, the original knowledge of how these objects functioned appears to erode. Later, scribes copy words they no longer fully understand. Technical descriptions harden into ritual language. Procedures are preserved, but explanations disappear. What remains is a system followed out of fear rather than comprehension. This loss of understanding does not reduce danger. In fact, it increases it. Several late records mention old prohibitions whose reasons are forgotten. This phrase appears in different cities and centuries, suggesting a widespread awareness that rules existed without clear origin. Yet the rules were still enforced because breaking them still produced consequences. Human rulers step more fully into the foreground during this period. Kings claim authority granted by higher powers, but they also accept responsibility for maintaining order. They present themselves not as conquerors wielding divine weapons, but as guardians preventing their misuse. Inscriptions emphasize restraint as much as strength. This is reflected in warfare. Conflicts continue, but the scale of devastation changes. Cities are captured rather than erased. Fields are burned but replanted. The land recovers. The absence of descriptions of vitrified soil or long-term sterility suggests that the most extreme tools remain unused. The shift from intervention to governance becomes clear. Law codes emerge, boundaries are defined, disputes are settled through administration rather than annihilation. The memory of past destruction lingers as a warning, shaping behavior even when its cause is no longer fully understood. The tablets themselves become a kind of containment. Dangerous knowledge is embedded within layers of language that grow increasingly symbolic. Myths form around events once recorded plainly. Gods replace systems. Fate replaces control. This transformation protects future generations from accidentally reactivating what they cannot manage. Yet the core details persist. Weapons that move on their own. Objects that must remain sealed. Chambers that cannot be entered safely. Land that remains uninhabitable long after catastrophe. These elements survive translation and reinterpretation because they correspond to physical reality. Archaeological surveys reveal zones that remain oddly empty across centuries, fertile areas left untouched, cities never rebuilt. These absences align with textual references to forbidden ground. The reason is not stated, but the avoidance is consistent. People remember where not to go. By this stage, the Anunnaki themselves recede into abstraction. They are no longer described as active participants. They become ancestral authorities, invoked but distant. Their weapons remain, but their hands are gone. Responsibility rests with those who inherited the aftermath. This inheritance is heavy. The scribes know they are preserving something dangerous. In one late tablet, a copyist notes that the text he is transcribing comes from days before understanding was lost. This rare moment of self-awareness hints at the fragility of memory. Knowledge can survive in form while vanishing in substance. What endures is behavior. Do not open, do not touch, do not wake. These imperatives echo across centuries. They shape architecture, ritual, and law. They are the legacy of a civilization that learned, perhaps too late, that some tools are better left unused. And so the temples stand as both sanctuaries and vaults. Above, prayers rise. Below, sealed chambers hold remnants of a past no one wishes to repeat. The tablets do not celebrate this arrangement, they accept it. Living with restraint becomes the final adaptation. Not mastery, not conquest, but distance. The world continues not because the weapons were destroyed, but because they were remembered, feared, and kept asleep. By the time the tablets reach what modern scholars call the later periods, the world they describe is no longer one of open confrontation between overwhelming forces. Instead, it is a landscape shaped by absence. Entire regions remain empty. Cities are rebuilt everywhere except in certain places where nothing returns. The scribes do not dramatize this emptiness. They mark it, record it, and move on as if everyone already knows why those lands are avoided. These forbidden zones appear repeatedly in administrative texts. They are not mythic wastelands populated by monsters. They are practical exclusions, fields where crops fail, wells whose water sickens, roads that bypass entire stretches of otherwise fertile ground. The language used is not moral, it is descriptive. The land is said to be struck, weakened, or remembering. That last term is especially revealing. Memory here does not imply consciousness, it implies persistence. In medical texts, the same word for memory is used to describe illnesses that recur after apparent recovery. A wound heals, but the body remembers. Symptoms return. Strength fades again. When the same word is applied to soil, it suggests the scribes understood that damage could linger invisibly long after the initial event had passed. People who travel too close to these zones are said to waste away, not immediately. They return home, then weaken, they lose hair. Their skin breaks, they die slowly. The texts emphasize delay as if the time between exposure and illness made the cause difficult to understand. The scribes do not propose explanations, they simply advise avoidance. What is striking is how consistently these descriptions avoid supernatural framing. There are no curses spoken, no spirits blamed. The danger is inherent to the place itself. The land is unsafe regardless of intention or ritual. This attitude suggests hard-earned knowledge passed down through experience rather than belief. The Sumerians were not witnesses to the original catastrophes described in the oldest texts. They arrived afterward. Their cities rose among ruins, sealed chambers, and altered landscapes. They inherited a world already shaped by forces beyond their comprehension. Their task was not to understand those forces, but to survive among their remnants. This perspective explains why so many tablets focus on consequences rather than causes. The scribes are not engineers reverse engineering lost technology. They are archivists cataloguing risk. Their records resemble hazard maps more than myths. Where not to build, where not to dig, where not to drink. In several city records, a pattern emerges. A settlement flourishes, then abruptly relocates without signs of war or famine. The new location is often only a short distance away. Archaeologically, this is puzzling. Strategically and economically, it makes little sense. Textually, however, it aligns with references to ground that should not be disturbed. The decision to abandon a functioning city requires strong motivation. The tablets never state it outright, But the implication is clear: the risk outweighed the benefit. Living elsewhere, even with fewer resources, was safer than remaining near something buried. As generations pass, the memory of why these zones are dangerous fades. What remains are taboos. Children are told not to go there. Shepherds avoid grazing animals nearby. Builders refuse to quarry stone from certain hills. These practices persist even when no one can articulate their origin. This is how technical knowledge degrades into custom. The original reason disappears, but the behavior survives because it continues to work. People who ignore the taboo get sick. Those who obey remain healthy. The rule proves itself without explanation. Later, religious texts attempt to rationalize these customs. Dangerous places become cursed by gods. Illness becomes punishment. The land's memory becomes divine anger. These reinterpretations make sense within a symbolic framework, but they obscure the practical origin of the avoidance. Yet traces of the older understanding remain embedded in language. The gods are said to fear these places as well. This is an odd claim in a religious context. Deities are not usually afraid of their own curses. Fear implies hazard, not judgment. The same pattern appears in descriptions of buried chambers. Later myths describe them as sacred or forbidden because of holiness. Earlier administrative records describe them as restricted due to danger. The shift is subtle but profound. Holiness replaces hazard as understanding fades. Archaeological evidence again mirrors the text. In some forbidden zones, soil samples show anomalies that persist long after surrounding land recovers. These anomalies vary by location, but their presence supports the idea that the danger was not imagined. Something remained. The Sumerians did not attempt to cleanse these places. They did not perform grand rituals to restore them. They avoided them. This restraint contrasts sharply with later cultures that sought to dominate or sanctify dangerous spaces. The Sumerian response is pragmatic. If a place harms those who approach it, leave it alone. This mindset extends to their treatment of inherited objects. Weapons and control devices are not displayed as trophies. They are hidden. Their existence is acknowledged only within restricted circles. Public religion emphasizes order, fertility, and stability, not power. The Anunnaki, once described as active authorities, become distant figures associated with a past that no longer intrudes directly. Their war is over, its aftermath remains. Humanity lives in the shadow of something it did not cause and cannot undo. The tablets reflect this acceptance. There is no call to reclaim forbidden lands, no ambition to recover lost weapons. The goal is continuity, not mastery. Civilization advances by building around danger rather than confronting it. This is perhaps the most telling aspect of the entire corpus. The Sumerians do not dream of repeating the past. They do not seek the power of the Anunnaki. They seek to avoid their mistakes. The memory of catastrophe shapes restraint into virtue. Over time, this restraint becomes embedded in law, custom, and myth. What began as technical avoidance becomes moral wisdom. Do not disturb what should remain buried. Do not awaken what sleeps. Do not return to places that remember destruction. The tablets preserve this lesson without preaching it. They do not tell future generations what to believe. They show them where others died and where the land never healed. The implication is left to the reader. In a world already damaged, survival depends not on conquering every force, but on recognizing which ones cannot be controlled. The Sumerians learned this lesson not through theory, but through inheritance. Their records do not offer solutions. They offer boundaries, and within those boundaries, civilization endured. As the tablets continue into later centuries, another transformation becomes clear. What was once recorded as operational knowledge begins to harden into doctrine. The shift is subtle, almost invisible unless the texts are read side by side across generations. The same words appear, the same phrases recur, but their function changes. What was once instruction becomes formula. What was once caution becomes ritual. This transition is not driven by deception, it is driven by loss. The people copying these tablets are no longer living near freshly devastated land. They are not witnessing chambers being sealed after fatal mistakes. They inherit the words, but not the experiences that gave those words meaning. As a result, language begins to drift. Terms that once described procedures are reinterpreted as divine mysteries. Words that referred to containment are reimagined as holiness. The sleep of weapons becomes sacred rest. The sealing of chambers becomes consecration. The difference seems minor, but it alters behavior. When danger becomes holiness, fear softens into reverence. Yet the old rules remain embedded beneath the new interpretation. Access is still restricted. Time limits still exist. Certain actions are still forbidden. The explanation changes, but the structure does not. This is how a technical system survives cultural transformation without being fully understood. One of the clearest examples of this process appears in the treatment of the Tablet of Destinies. Earlier texts describe it as a device whose possession determines control. Later ones describe it as the embodiment of fate itself. Destiny becomes something written, fixed, immutable. The tablet is no longer an interface, it is law. But even in these later accounts, inconsistencies persist. The tablet can still be stolen, it can still be lost. Its removal still causes chaos. Fate, in abstract philosophy, does not behave this way. Law does not stop functioning because someone picks it up. These lingering contradictions betray the object's original role. The same process occurs with descriptions of radiance and fear. Melem, once treated as an active field that disables resistance, becomes a divine aura, inspiring awe. Yet kings still claim to wear it before battle, and its effects are still described as overwhelming opponents without contact. The language has shifted, but the outcome remains. The scribes themselves sometimes struggle with this transition. In some tablets, explanatory glosses appear in the margins, offering symbolic interpretations of older passages. These glosses attempt to reconcile unfamiliar descriptions with contemporary belief. They rarely succeed fully. Instead, they create layered texts where technical memory and theological explanation coexist uneasily. Education reflects this shift. In scribal schools, students copy ancient texts as exercises in writing rather than as repositories of knowledge. They learn the forms, not the context. Difficult terms are memorized, not understood. The act of copying becomes preservation without comprehension. This process protects society in one sense. By obscuring dangerous knowledge, it reduces the risk of misuse. A student who believes a weapon is a metaphor is unlikely to seek it out. Myth becomes a safety mechanism. At the same time, this obscurity carries its own danger. Procedures preserved without understanding can be misapplied. Rituals performed mechanically lose their protective nuance. Several late texts hint at this problem. They mention old prohibitions that are followed because it is written, not because their purpose is known. In a few rare cases, scribes express unease. They note that certain practices are carried out without clarity, that meanings are recited without weight. These are quiet warnings buried in administrative language, but they reveal anxiety about erosion of knowledge. The physical environment mirrors this textual change. Sealed chambers remain, but their contents become increasingly mysterious, even to those responsible for guarding them. Some are never opened again. Others are inspected only rarely. Over time, locations are forgotten or misremembered. This gradual forgetting explains why some later catastrophes appear sudden and inexplicable. When a rule exists without a reason, it is eventually broken. When the consequence follows, it appears arbitrary, reinforcing superstition rather than understanding. The Sumerian record shows this cycle beginning to form. Technical danger becomes sacred taboo. Sacred taboo becomes tradition. Tradition becomes habit. Habit becomes vulnerable to neglect. Yet the original texts endure, stubbornly precise beneath layers of interpretation. They continue to record outcomes rather than morals. They do not praise obedience. They show what happens when boundaries are crossed. The Anunnaki themselves undergo the same transformation. Once described as administrators managing inherited systems, they become cosmic creators and judges. Their war becomes a mythic age. Their fear becomes moral authority. But traces of their earlier portrayal remain, especially in moments where even gods hesitate or withdraw. These inconsistencies are not errors. They are fossils of an earlier understanding embedded in later belief. They point backward to a time when the danger was known directly. The most remarkable aspect of this transition is that restraint survives it. Even when the reason is lost, the behavior continues, weapons remain sealed, forbidden zones remain empty. Extreme measures are not repeated. This persistence suggests that the system of avoidance was effective enough to reinforce itself. Those who ignored it suffered. Those who respected it survived. Over generations, this outcome became proof. The tablets do not present this as enlightenment. There is no celebration of wisdom gained. There is only continuity. Life goes on within limits shaped by long-forgotten catastrophe. By the end of this period, the memory of how the world was changed has become myth, but the shape of the change remains etched into geography, architecture, and law. Civilization advances not by reclaiming what was lost, but by building carefully around it. In this way, the Sumerian record reveals something rare. Not a culture intoxicated by power, but one sobered by its consequences. Not a mythology glorifying destruction, but an archive quietly insisting that some forces, once known too well, are best remembered only as warnings. And within those warnings, preserved across languages and centuries, lies the outline of a truth that refuses to disappear. Knowledge does not vanish when it becomes myth. It simply hides, waiting to be misunderstood, or, if carelessly unearthed, repeated. When the Sumerian corpus is read as a whole, a pattern emerges that is easy to miss if each tablet is treated in isolation. The texts are not obsessed with origins. They show little interest in how the weapons were made or where the Anunnaki came from. Instead, they return again and again to aftermath, what remains, what lingers, what cannot be undone. This focus reveals something essential about the position of the scribes themselves. They were not chroniclers of invention. They were witnesses to inheritance. The Sumerians understood themselves as living after something had already gone wrong. Their world was not pristine. It was damaged terrain, layered with restrictions and absences. Certain lands could not be used, certain objects could not be touched. Certain actions could not be repeated. These were not abstract prohibitions. They were responses to conditions that still existed. This explains why the tablets rarely speculate. There is no attempt to theorize how the weapons functioned, no effort to reverse engineer divine technology. The scribes describe what happens when boundaries are crossed, not why those boundaries exist. They behave like people who know from experience that curiosity is dangerous. In several texts, this attitude becomes explicit. Phrases appear that translate roughly to "it is not for knowing" or "it is not for approaching." These are not statements of ignorance, they are statements of refusal. Knowledge is deliberately limited because its pursuit carries unacceptable risk. This stance distinguishes the Sumerian record from later traditions that celebrate revelation. Here, revelation is suspect. Hidden things are hidden for a reason. The goal is stability, not understanding. The scribes preserve enough information to maintain safety, but no more. Even curiosity about the past is constrained. When ancient events are referenced, they are framed as warnings rather than achievements. The war of the Anunnaki is not a golden age, it is a catastrophe. The flood is not purification, it is failure. The weapons are not gifts, they are burdens. This worldview shapes how history itself is recorded. Kings boast of victories, but rarely of annihilation. Power is measured in control and endurance, not destruction. The most respected rulers are those who restore order without unleashing forces that cannot be recalled. In this context, the absence of certain information becomes meaningful. There are no instructions for reactivating the most dangerous systems, no manuals, no diagrams. If such knowledge ever existed, it was not passed on. What survives are fragments, stripped of actionable detail. This omission is deliberate. The scribes were capable of technical writing. They produced detailed instructions for irrigation, construction, medicine, and astronomy. Their silence regarding weapon operation is not a limitation of skill, it is a choice. The same restraint appears in how disasters are framed. When something goes wrong, the texts do not seek to assign blame. They do not moralize, they record what happened and what was done afterward. The emphasis is always on containment and prevention. This attitude suggests a culture shaped by trauma rather than triumph. The memory of devastation is not distant enough to be romanticized. It remains close enough to command respect. The past is not a source of pride, it is a source of caution. As time passes, this caution hardens into identity. The Sumerians come to define themselves not by what they can do, but by what they refuse to do. They do not rebuild certain cities, they do not reopen certain chambers, they do not reactivate certain weapons. Later cultures inherit this restraint without always understanding it. What begins as technical avoidance becomes moral injunction. Do not anger the gods, do not disturb the deep, do not challenge fate. These ideas carry emotional weight, but they originate in practical danger. This transformation does not erase the original meaning, it obscures it. The core behavior remains the same. Avoidance continues to protect those who obey it, even as the explanation changes. The tablets themselves act as stabilizing artifacts within this system. They preserve memory without inviting reenactment. Their dry tone discourages fascination. There is no spectacle to imitate, only records to heed. Even when mythic embellishment appears in later retellings, the underlying structure persists. Power is always shown as risky. Authority is always constrained. Excess leads to collapse. These themes are not moral lessons imposed from above. They are conclusions drawn from experience. One of the most revealing features of the corpus is how rarely it celebrates knowledge for its own sake. Wisdom is not accumulation. It is discernment. Knowing when not to act. Knowing when to seal, withdraw, and wait. This is a stark contrast to modern assumptions about progress. In the Sumerian record, progress does not come from mastering every force. It comes from surviving what cannot be mastered. Civilization advances by narrowing its scope, not expanding it recklessly. The Anunnaki, once feared administrators of overwhelming systems, fade into symbolic ancestors precisely because their era is not meant to return. Their presence in the texts serves as boundary markers. This is where the danger lies. Do not cross. The persistence of this message across centuries suggests it was reinforced repeatedly by reality. People who ignored boundaries suffered. People who respected them endured. Over time, survival itself became proof. This dynamic helps explain why the Sumerian tradition endured so long. It was not built on conquest or domination, but on memory and restraint. It adapted to a world already altered rather than trying to restore an impossible past. By the end of the corpus, the message is clear without ever being stated outright. Some knowledge cannot be safely recovered. Some powers, once known too well, must remain buried. The cost of remembering them fully would be too high. The tablets do not ask the future to understand everything they contain. They ask it to respect the limits those texts quietly enforce. The absence of explanation is itself a form of protection. In this sense, the Sumerian scribes were not merely recording history, they were shaping behavior across time. They encoded caution into culture, using myth as a buffer against misuse. What they left behind is not a manual for lost technology, but a map of danger. It shows where catastrophe once occurred and where it must never be allowed to happen again. And in that quiet refusal to explain too much, the Sumerian record reveals its deepest wisdom. Survival is not guaranteed by knowledge alone, but by the discipline to let certain knowledge remain incomplete. When modern archaeology enters the story, it does so awkwardly, as if stepping into a conversation that began thousands of years earlier and never paused. The ground beneath Mesopotamia does not argue with the tablets, it echoes them. Excavations across the region reveal layers that refuse to fit neatly into familiar categories of war, fire, or flood. These layers do not tell stories, they present conditions. In many ancient cities, archaeologists encounter what are called destruction layers. Normally, these are easy to read: collapsed walls, ash, weapons, signs of prolonged burning. But in a number of Sumerian and early Akkadian sites, something else appears. Brick fused together as if briefly liquefied. Stone surfaces warped, not shattered. Soil transformed into glassy sheets. These effects require temperatures far beyond any known technology of the Bronze Age. What makes these layers more troubling is their inconsistency. Entire neighborhoods are affected while adjacent areas remain almost untouched. There is no gradual gradient, no spreading pattern that would suggest wildfire or urban collapse. The damage looks targeted, focused, intentional. This pattern appears in multiple locations separated by distance and time. Ur, Uruk, Lagash, Nippur, Mari. Different cities, different centuries, similar anomalies. Archaeologists catalogue them carefully, often offering conservative explanations. Lightning strikes, bitumen fires, meteor airbursts. Each hypothesis explains one feature while failing to account for the rest. Lightning does not vitrify large areas of soil. Bitumen fires burn long and leave residue. Meteor impacts create craters and ejecta. The Mesopotamian layers show none of these signatures consistently. Instead, they align most closely with descriptions found in the tablets: sudden heat, short duration, lasting sterility. The text never describe craters, they describe strikes. They describe light without fire, they describe earth hardened like kiln-fired clay. The correspondence is not perfect, but it is uncomfortable. Even more revealing are the absences. In several places, destruction layers are followed by long gaps in occupation. Centuries pass before rebuilding occurs, if it occurs at all. This is unusual in a region where land was precious and population pressure constant. Cities were typically rebuilt quickly, even after catastrophic floods or invasions. Here they are not. Administrative texts provide a possible explanation. Certain zones are marked as forbidden, not cursed, not mourned, simply avoided. The language is practical: do not settle, do not dig, do not draw water. These prohibitions persist long after political authority changes. Empires rise and fall, but the empty spaces remain empty. Modern surveys confirm this pattern. Some of the most fertile-looking land in southern Mesopotamia shows repeated avoidance across millennia. When settlements reappear nearby, they are carefully positioned just outside these zones. This is not coincidence, it is learned behavior. The tablets describe similar behavior following the wars of the Anunnaki. After certain weapons are used, the land is said to be dead, not temporarily damaged, dead. The same word appears in medical texts to describe organs that no longer recover. The implication is permanence. This permanence is key. Natural disasters devastate, but they also renew. Floods deposit silt, fires clear growth, war ruins cities, but the soil remains usable. The Sumerian texts distinguish these from another category entirely: places where nothing returns. Archaeology confirms that distinction exists in the physical record. Another anomaly appears in underground architecture. As discussed earlier, chambers beneath temples show unusual features. In some cases, the stone itself shows signs of thermal alteration after construction. The walls appear heat-affected from the inside, not the outside. This suggests exposure to something contained, not an external fire. Such findings are rarely highlighted. They complicate narratives. They resist simple classification. Yet they exist in excavation reports, quietly noted and set aside. When these features are compared with temple texts describing inspection incidents and lingering sickness, a coherent picture emerges. Something was stored. It remained dangerous even when inactive. Proximity mattered, time mattered, containment mattered. Modern language struggles to describe this without invoking anachronism. Ancient language struggled as well. The scribes used the words they had. Sleep, shine, strike, sicken, harden. Remember, these are observational terms. They describe effects, not mechanisms. Archaeology, constrained by similar limits, does the same. It records altered material states without fully explaining their cause. One of the most revealing parallels between text and ground lies in scale. Neither describes total destruction everywhere. Both describe selective devastation. This selectivity undermines explanations based on uncontrolled natural events. It supports scenarios involving directed force. The Sumerians did not claim to understand this force. They assigned it to gods because that was the only category large enough to contain it. Modern scholarship often dismisses this as mythology, but the physical evidence refuses to dismiss itself. What archaeology adds to the conversation is silence. It cannot confirm intent. It cannot name perpetrators. It cannot reconstruct technology. But it can confirm that the land behaved in ways inconsistent with ordinary human activity. This silence aligns with the tablet's restraint. Neither text nor ground tells a complete story. Both insist on boundaries. The Sumerians did not build monuments atop certain ruins. They did not sanctify them. They avoided them. Archaeology shows that avoidance clearly. It is visible in settlement maps, trade routes, and irrigation layouts. This behavior is not consistent with religious awe. It is consistent with hazard recognition. When later cultures inherit these landscapes, they inherit the avoidance without always inheriting the explanation. Over time, myth fills the gap. Dangerous places become cursed. Forbidden chambers become holy. What was once technical caution becomes sacred taboo. Yet the underlying pattern persists. The land remains empty. The chambers remain sealed. The texts remain cautious. Modern archaeology does not need to accept the Sumerian explanations to acknowledge the alignment. Something happened. It altered the environment. It left zones of long-term risk. It prompted sustained behavioral change. That alone is extraordinary. The tablets and the ground together form a composite record. One preserves memory, the other preserves consequence. Neither is complete alone. Together they challenge the assumption that ancient descriptions of devastation are always symbolic or exaggerated. The Sumerians did not write about their world as if it were safe. They wrote as if it had already been wounded. Archaeology confirms that the wounds were real. What remains unresolved is not whether the damage existed, but how it was caused. The texts offer one explanation. Modern scholarship hesitates to accept it. The ground, indifferent to interpretation, continues to bear the marks. In that tension lies the true weight of the Sumerian record. It is not a claim of divine war demanding belief. It is a convergence of memory and material that demands caution. The ancient scribes did not ask the future to agree with them. They asked it to notice what they noticed. Changed land, persistent danger, the cost of forgetting. Archaeology, arriving late, finds itself doing exactly that. As the layers of text and soil converge, one final pattern becomes impossible to ignore. The Sumerian record does not describe a civilization reaching upward toward the gods. It describes one living beneath them in the shadow of consequences left behind. This distinction matters because it reshapes how every earlier detail should be read. The Anunnaki are not distant creators. They are predecessors. Whatever they did happened before human order stabilized and humanity inherited the aftermath rather than the cause. The tablets repeatedly imply that humans arrived into a world already altered. Rivers had shifted, land had been rendered unusable. Zones of danger were already marked when the first cities were founded. This explains why some of the earliest urban plans appear unusually cautious. Settlements are clustered tightly. Irrigation is controlled carefully. Expansion is restrained. Growth is deliberate rather than aggressive. This behavior is not typical of a civilization discovering fertile land for the first time. It is typical of one navigating around hazards it does not fully understand. The Anunnaki, as they appear in the earliest texts, are not creators shaping a blank world. They are managers attempting to stabilize something already unstable. Their councils argue not over creation, but over containment. Their conflicts do not introduce chaos, they worsen it. And when those conflicts end, the focus shifts almost immediately to restraint. This reframes the concept of divine authority in the Sumerian world. Authority is not celebrated, it is feared. The power to act is inseparable from the risk of irreversible harm. Even the highest figures hesitate. Even they withdraw. Human rulers inherit this attitude. Kings are praised not for expanding endlessly, but for maintaining balance. They boast of building canals, restoring fields, and keeping order. Destruction is mentioned only briefly, often with regret. The model of leadership that emerges is defensive rather than expansive. This defensive posture explains the obsessive attention paid to boundaries, physical boundaries between safe land and forbidden zones, procedural boundaries governing access to sealed chambers, linguistic boundaries limiting how much can be said or understood. The Sumerians construct a civilization around limits. This is not a culture obsessed with transcendence. It is a culture obsessed with survival. One of the most striking features of the texts is how little interest they show in reclaiming lost power. The weapons of the Anunnaki are never framed as tools humanity should aspire to wield. They are described as reminders of what happens when force exceeds control. The idea of progress through increased power simply does not appear. Instead, progress is measured through stability, through repetition, through the absence of catastrophe. A good reign is one in which nothing irreversible happens. This worldview persists even as languages change and empires rise and fall. Akkadian, Babylonian, Assyrian, scribes all preserve the same core anxieties. They may reinterpret causes, but they retain avoidance. They do not reopen what was sealed. They do not resettle what was abandoned. In later texts, the Anunnaki fade further into abstraction, but the rules attributed to them remain. It is as if the gods themselves become less important than the consequences of their actions. Memory detaches from personality and attaches to place. Certain hills remain untouched. Certain ruins remain silent. Certain stories are told without detail, as if elaboration itself might be dangerous. This silence is not ignorance, it is discipline. The Sumerians did not lack imagination. Their literature is rich, poetic, and complex. When they choose restraint, it is intentional. They understood that some narratives invite repetition. To describe something too vividly is to tempt reenactment. The most dangerous events are therefore described sparingly. This is why the wars of the Anunnaki are sketched rather than detailed, why weapons are listed but not explained, why effects are recorded but mechanisms ignored. The scribes preserve memory without providing a blueprint. Modern readers often mistake this for primitiveness. In reality, it may reflect a sophisticated understanding of risk. Knowledge can be harmful if separated from context. The safest way to transmit a warning is to remove the temptation to experiment. This approach aligns with how the Sumerians treated other dangers. Floods are recorded, but not engineered. Diseases are described, but not weaponized. Astronomy is used for calendars, not prediction of fate. Control is always limited. The result is a civilization that lasts. Sumer does not collapse suddenly. It evolves, transforms, and merges into successor cultures. Its cities fall and rise again, but the core behavioral patterns persist. This persistence suggests success. Whatever the Sumerians feared, they managed to avoid repeating it. From a modern perspective, this restraint is striking. We often assume that knowledge demands use, that power demands expression. The Sumerian record suggests the opposite, that some knowledge demands containment, that some power demands refusal. The Anunnaki in this reading are not gods to worship or aliens to speculate about. They are placeholders for an inherited catastrophe, a way to speak about forces too large, too dangerous, and too poorly understood to be treated casually. Their war becomes a boundary myth, not a story of origins, but a story of limits. The final irony is that this strategy works too well. By embedding danger inside myth, the Sumerians ensure it survives, but also ensure it is misunderstood. Future generations see drama where there was warning, symbol where there was instruction. And yet, enough survives. The empty lands, the sealed chambers, the procedural language hidden in ritual, the fear that appears whenever boundaries are crossed. These are not artifacts of belief, they are residues of experience. The Sumerians did not try to solve the mystery of what happened before them. They accepted that the cost of understanding might be too high. Instead, they chose to remember just enough to stay alive. That choice shaped everything that followed. Cities grew where it was safe. Laws replaced force. Ritual replaced intervention. Silence replaced curiosity. In doing so, they left behind a record unlike any other, not a tale of ascent, but of recovery, not a myth of power, but of restraint. And in that restraint lies the most unsettling implication of all, that the greatest wisdom preserved in the oldest texts is not how to build or conquer, but how to stop. How to recognize that some chapters of history must never be reopened, not because they are forgotten, but because they are remembered too well. As the centuries advance and the original Sumerian voice fades into successor cultures, the underlying structure of restraint does not disappear. Instead, it becomes embedded so deeply that it is no longer recognized as a response to danger. It becomes normal. What once required vigilance now feels like tradition. This is the most effective form of containment the tablets describe, even if they never name it as such. By the time Babylonian and Assyrian scribes inherit the archive, the language has shifted, but the behavior remains unchanged. Certain texts are still copied without explanation. Certain places are still avoided without justification. Certain procedures are still followed without understanding. The system functions precisely because it no longer depends on conscious memory. This transition marks a critical point. When restraint becomes habit, it survives longer than fear. Fear fades, habit persists. Later law codes offer insight into this process. They do not mention ancient weapons or divine catastrophes. Instead, they define boundaries, where one may build, where one may dig, what land belongs to whom. These rules appear administrative, but they encode much older lessons. The law quietly replaces the ritual as the primary mechanism of control. What is remarkable is how rarely these laws are challenged. Even when empires conquer Mesopotamia, they adopt its boundaries rather than erase them. New rulers claim authority over land, but they do not expand into forbidden zones. They respect limits they did not create. This continuity suggests that the danger remained demonstrable. Even without knowing why, people learned that violating certain boundaries led to suffering. Empires built on conquest are pragmatic. They do not avoid fertile land without reason. The persistence of avoidance implies that the reason continued to exist. The mythology surrounding these places evolves, but the behavior does not. Hills become associated with demons, ruins become haunted. These stories discourage intrusion, especially among the untrained. Myth becomes a protective wrapper around hazard. This is not unique to Mesopotamia, but it is unusually well documented there. The tablets preserve the moment when myth is consciously used to obscure knowledge. Dangerous truths are wrapped in narrative not to deceive, but to protect. One later Assyrian text explicitly warns against seeking the knowledge of the distant past. It states that some records are not for the living. This phrase has often been interpreted spiritually. In context, it reads like a safety warning. Certain knowledge does not belong to those without the means to handle it. The scribes themselves appear to understand this responsibility. They do not simplify dangerous texts. They do not make them accessible. Instead, they preserve them in dead languages, copied by specialists trained to replicate without altering. Obscurity becomes a feature, not a flaw. This decision has long-term consequences. As understanding fades, curiosity resurfaces. Myths once intended to discourage become invitations to reinterpret. Gods become heroes, catastrophes become epics. What was once feared becomes fascinating. This shift is gradual, but its beginnings are visible in the later tablets. Stories grow more elaborate. Details once avoided are embellished. The emotional tone shifts from caution to awe. This marks the moment when memory begins to lose its protective edge. Yet even as interpretation drifts, the physical constraints remain. The land does not forget. Sealed chambers do not open themselves. Sterile zones do not heal because belief changes. Reality enforces rules long after explanation fades. This tension creates a recurring pattern. Periods of stability are punctuated by brief episodes of disaster when boundaries are tested or forgotten. These episodes are rarely catastrophic on the scale of earlier ages, but they are enough to reinforce avoidance. The tablets record these moments obliquely. A city sickens, a river becomes undrinkable, a district is abandoned. The language is familiar by now. The response is also familiar. Seal, withdraw, wait. Over time, this cycle produces a culture deeply skeptical of unchecked power. Authority is tolerated only when it demonstrates restraint. Leaders who promise radical change are viewed with suspicion. Stability becomes the highest virtue. This skepticism shapes Mesopotamian political thought. Kings justify their rule by claiming continuity, not innovation. They restore temples, they re-establish boundaries, they maintain order. Rarely do they boast of overturning the past. Even conquest is framed as restoration. Invaders claim to bring back proper worship and ancient law. This rhetorical pattern reflects a society that equates survival with adherence to inherited limits. The most striking consequence of this worldview is its influence beyond Mesopotamia. As neighboring cultures absorb Mesopotamian myths, they also absorb its anxieties. Flood stories spread, divine weapons appear in altered forms, sacred prohibitions multiply, yet the original context is diluted. Later cultures remember the drama but forget the restraint. They tell stories of gods wielding power without inheriting the fear that once accompanied it. This divergence explains why the Mesopotamian record feels different from later mythologies. It lacks triumph. It lacks celebration. It is subdued, procedural, wary. It remembers too much to be impressed. The Sumerians and their successors did not seek transcendence. They sought equilibrium. They accepted that the world they lived in had limits imposed by forces beyond their control. Rather than challenge those limits, they organized around them. This organizational genius, rather than any technological breakthrough, may explain the longevity of Mesopotamian civilization. It did not burn itself out chasing power it could not sustain. It learned when to stop. As the tablets approach their end, The voice of warning grows quieter but no less persistent. It no longer needs to speak loudly. The behavior it shaped has become instinct. The greatest success of the Sumerian system is that it makes itself invisible. People live within boundaries without remembering why those boundaries exist. They simply know that crossing them is unwise. From the outside, this looks like conservatism. From within, it feels like survival. And this is the final stage of inheritance described by the tablets. Danger transformed into law, law transformed into habit, habit transformed into identity. The weapons sleep not because they are guarded constantly, but because no one dares to wake them. The flood remains sealed not because rituals are perfect, but because no one seeks the key. What began as a response to catastrophe becomes a way of life. The memory of devastation fades, but its imprint endures in the shape of society itself. This is the quiet legacy of the Sumerian world, not the invention of writing or the rise of cities, but the discipline to live with what cannot be undone. In that discipline lies a warning that survives even when its origin is forgotten. Power is not always something to be reclaimed. Sometimes the greatest achievement is learning to let it remain buried. As the record approaches its final stretch, the Sumerian worldview reveals its most paradoxical feature. The civilization that gave the world writing, law, and urban life does not celebrate mastery. It celebrates limitation. Progress in these texts is not defined by how much power can be accumulated, but by how much destruction can be avoided. This is not an accidental theme. It is the core lesson that survives everything else. The tablets never suggest that the dangers inherited from the Anunnaki were solved. They were managed, they were isolated, they were outlived. This distinction matters because it reframes the entire idea of success. Victory is not overcoming the past. Victory is preventing its return. As later generations distance themselves from the original catastrophes, they also distance themselves from the temptation to repeat them. The more mythic the old events become, the less actionable they are. This is not failure of memory, it is memory doing its job. The Sumerian scribes understood something subtle. Raw knowledge does not equal wisdom. Some information, when stripped of context, becomes lethal. To preserve society, they allowed understanding to erode while preserving behavior. The rules mattered more than the reasons. This approach can be seen in how technical vocabulary is allowed to decay. Words once precise become symbolic. Functions become attributes. Devices become divine qualities. This transformation is often treated as intellectual decline. In context, it appears deliberate. By turning dangerous systems into abstract myths, the scribes reduce the risk of imitation. No one tries to rebuild what they believe to be supernatural. No one attempts to repair what they think belongs to gods. The loss of comprehension becomes a shield. This is not anti-intellectualism. It is selective ignorance practiced with intent. The tablets also reveal an understanding of generational psychology. Fear does not transmit reliably across centuries. Trauma fades or replaces dread. To counter this, the Sumerians embed restraint into institutions rather than emotion. Law, architecture, ritual, and geography carry the burden of memory so that people do not have to. A child does not need to know why a place is forbidden if everyone avoids it. A ruler does not need to understand ancient weapons if their use is legally impossible. Behavior persists even as explanation dissolves. This strategy works until curiosity resurfaces. The tablets hint at this danger as well. They record moments when boundaries weaken, when old rules are questioned, when forbidden knowledge becomes attractive. These moments are followed by sickness, collapse, or abandonment. The pattern reinforces itself. What the Sumerian record ultimately preserves is not fear of gods, but fear of consequences. The gods become faces attached to warnings. Their personalities change, their names change, the warning does not. This is why the record remains strangely modern in its logic. It does not argue morality, it presents outcomes, it does not threaten punishment, it shows aftermath. The assumption is that rational beings will choose survival over curiosity once they understand the cost. The Anunnaki, in their final form, are less characters than containers for memory. They hold the place of a past too dangerous to describe plainly. Their war is never meant to be reenacted. It is meant to be remembered just enough to prevent repetition. This framing challenges many modern interpretations. It suggests that the earliest myths were not attempts to explain the unknown, but attempts to restrict access to it. Storytelling becomes a form of safety engineering. The most unsettling implication of this is not about the past, but about the future. If a civilization as early as Sumer recognized the danger of certain knowledge, what does that imply about the forces they encountered? And what does it imply about our own relationship with power? The Sumerians did not believe everything could be fixed. They accepted irreversibility. Some actions permanently alter the world. Once taken, they cannot be undone. The only choice that remains is prevention. This acceptance runs counter to many later philosophies that emphasize redemption, restoration, or progress through struggle. In the Sumerian view, some thresholds, once crossed, end the conversation. This is why the flood is sealed forever. Why the most destructive weapons sleep. Why forbidden lands remain untouched. These are not temporary measures, they are permanent decisions. As the tablets draw towards silence, the message becomes almost austere. There is no call to heroism, no invitation to transcendence. There is only the instruction to endure. The Sumerians did not imagine a future free of danger. They imagined a future disciplined enough to survive alongside it. Their cities rose not because they conquered the world, but because they learned where not to build. Their laws endured not because they were perfect, but because they enforced restraint. Their myths survived not because they inspired action, but because they discouraged it. This inversion of values is what makes the record so difficult to read through modern eyes. We look for ambition, we find refusal, we look for innovation, we find containment, we look for explanation, we find silence. Yet that silence is not empty, it is heavy with intent. The final generations who copied these tablets may not have understood their origin, but they understood their weight. They preserved them without embellishment. They resisted the urge to modernize them. They treated them as something that must remain intact, even if opaque. In doing so, they ensured that the warning embedded within them would outlast any single interpretation. Even stripped of context, the pattern remains visible. Power leads to damage. Damage leads to restraint. Restraint leads to survival. This is not a comforting lesson. It offers no promise of redemption. It offers no vision of mastery. It offers continuity purchased at the cost of ambition. The Sumerian record does not end with resolution. It ends with maintenance, with boundaries held, with systems kept asleep, with dangerous knowledge buried beneath layers of myth and habit. And perhaps that is the most unsettling conclusion of all, that the first civilization understood something we continue to struggle with, that not every capability should be pursued, that not every door should be opened, that some legacies are best honored not by revival, but by refusal. In the quiet persistence of these ancient limits, the Sumerians left behind not a blueprint for power, but a discipline of restraint. And that discipline, more than any weapon or monument, may be their most enduring achievement. By the time the tablets fall silent, there is no sense of conclusion, only continuation. The Sumerian record does not resolve its tensions or explain its mysteries. It leaves them in place, deliberately unfinished. This lack of closure is not accidental. It reflects a worldview shaped by irreversible events, where the goal is not understanding everything, but ensuring that certain things never happen again. The final impression left by these texts is not fear, but vigilance. The danger they describe is not immediate, yet it is never considered gone. It exists beneath the surface of the world, sealed, avoided, remembered through habit rather than comprehension. The Sumerians did not expect future generations to solve the problem they inherited. They expected them to live with it. This expectation shapes the way time itself is treated in the tablets. History is not a march toward improvement. It is a balancing act. Each generation must maintain what the previous one preserved. Failure is not dramatic. It is gradual. Boundaries erode, procedures loosen, memory thins. Disaster follows not as punishment, but as consequence. The record offers no illusion that humanity becomes wiser over time. Knowledge fades, languages change, understanding narrows. What remains constant is the need for restraint. Civilization survives not because it accumulates insight, but because it enforces limits even when their origin is forgotten. This perspective gives new meaning to the endurance of the tablets themselves. They are not meant to be inspirational texts. They are anchors. Their repetition, dryness, and lack of spectacle are features, not flaws. They discourage fascination. They resist reinterpretation. They remain stubbornly practical even when wrapped in myth. The Sumerians seem to have understood that memory alone is fragile. Stories change, beliefs evolve. What lasts is structure, a sealed door, an abandoned field, a law that forbids excavation, a ritual that prevents access. These physical and social constraints do the work that explanation cannot. This is why the tablets rarely plead or persuade. They do not argue for restraint, they assume it. They present a world in which boundaries already exist, and the only question is whether they will be respected. The Anunnaki, in their final role, are no longer actors. They are placeholders for a past that must remain distant. Their names persist because something must occupy that space in memory, but their actions are never meant to be repeated, only referenced as the reason things are the way they are. This transforms the idea of myth itself. Myth is not a story about how things began. It is a system for ensuring certain things do not begin again. In this light, the silence at the end of the record is meaningful. There is no prophecy, no return, no final battle. The most destructive forces are not expected to re-emerge. They are expected to remain buried. The future imagined by the Sumerians is modest. Cities rise and fall, kings rule and die, floods come and go, but the deepest dangers remain locked away, never to be fully understood, never to be unleashed again. Stability, not transformation, is the highest aspiration. This worldview stands in stark contrast to later traditions that celebrate revelation, conquest, or redemption. The Sumerian legacy is quieter. It speaks of endurance rather than triumph, of survival rather than glory. The final tablets do not urge humanity to reach higher. They urge it to tread carefully. They assume that curiosity, ambition, and power will always tempt people toward forbidden ground. Their answer is not suppression, but inertia. Make the dangerous path so unappealing, so difficult, so obscured that no one chooses it. In this sense, the Sumerian civilization does not disappear. It dissolves into the fabric of everything that follows. Its caution becomes invisible. Its boundaries become normal. Its restraint becomes tradition. Even when its language dies, its behavior lives on. The sealed chambers remain sealed because no one remembers how to open them safely. The forbidden lands remain empty because no one remembers why they were abandoned, only that they should be. The weapons remain asleep because they have become myths, and myths are not touched. This is the success the Sumerians aimed for, whether consciously or not. Not remembrance through understanding, but remembrance through avoidance. Their record does not ask us to believe their explanations, it asks us to observe their outcomes. A civilization that endured by refusing to repeat the mistakes of a past it could not fully explain. The most unsettling realization is that this approach worked. For thousands of years, the catastrophic forces described in the earliest tablets did not reappear. The world continued, scarred but stable enough to sustain life and culture. The price was ignorance. The benefit was survival. The Sumerians chose survival. As modern readers, we are tempted to resolve their story, to identify the weapons, to decode the technology, to strip myth away and expose mechanism. The tablets themselves warn against this impulse. They show what happens when power outruns restraint. Their silence at the end is not a gap, it is a boundary. They leave us with no final revelation, only a pattern repeated across millennia. When something proves too destructive to control, the only winning move is not to play, seal it, bury it, forget how to use it. This is not a message of despair, it is a message of discipline. The Sumerians did not save the world by mastering every force within it. They saved it by learning when to stop, by accepting that some knowledge must remain incomplete, by embedding restraint so deeply into culture that it outlived understanding itself. In doing so, they offer a legacy that feels uncomfortably relevant. Not a warning shouted across time, but a quiet instruction encoded in habit, law, and silence. The tablets end where they began, not with answers, but with consequences. They leave the future with a choice, though they never frame it as such. Respect the boundaries inherited from the past, or relearn the lesson that made those boundaries necessary. They trusted that survival would teach the rest, and perhaps that is the final truth preserved in the oldest record humanity ever wrote. That wisdom is not always the act of knowing more, but the courage to know when enough is enough.